All right. Good evening, everybody. Are you able to see this first slide?
Yep.
I hear one yes, so I assume that everything is okay. All right. Our topic for today is David Thompson's surveying and mapping of the Northwest of North America. I'm Dave Gilbert, and before proceeding further into the slideshow, I want to mention that the American Society of Civil Engineers landmark program has recognized two very extensive surveying and mapping projects in the interior and the western coast of North America. One is Vancouver's mapping of the West Coast, which we dedicated in Port Townsend in 2009. And the second one is David Thompson's mapping, which is subject to the presentation today. And that was dedicated in April of this year up in Whistler, BC. As we go through this, we need to keep in mind how projects like this and similar projects led to some rather negative impacts on the Native American peoples. The encroachment into their native lands and the introduction of alcohol and guns and diseases destroyed many families and the cultures of entire tribes. And it was most unfortunate, but our recognition of these landmarks, of course, recognizes the technical achievements, which were quite great. We're going to see later on here in the presentation how David Thompson formed a lifelong alliance with a Native American person and made a much better effort than most Europeans to learn and appreciate the native cultures. He spoke many of their languages. So by way of introduction here, David Thompson was a surveyor for the big fur trading companies in Canada between 1790 and 1814. Spent 13 years with the Hudson's Bay Company, 17 years with the Northwest Company of Montreal. He traveled widely throughout the Canadian interior and along the northern tier US states, including Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and Washington State. During his travels, he made pretty accurate surveys as he went, and he later compiled them into a great map, which shows 1.7 million square miles of the North American interior. By comparison, that's about half of the United States area, and it's greater than the European Union. So it's an extremely large area. In his final years, he wrote a narrative of his travels. It was lost for many years, but found later on by a Canadian mining geologist by the name of J.B. Tyrrell. He declared David Thompson as the greatest land surveyor to have lived, or the greatest land geographer to have lived. I think it's a very appropriate accolade because he was a pretty extraordinary man. Last December, the ASCE and CSCE designated his work as an international historic civil engineering landmark. So today we're going to talk about David's early life, his surveying work with the Hudson Bay Company, his surveying work with the Northwest Company, and then his marriage to Charlotte Small. And then a very important part of his work was the Columbia River surveys, where he spent many years. And then later on, we'll talk about his maps, his retirement, and his memoirs, and then his final years. So David Thompson was born in London of Welsh parents, April 30th, 1770. His father died when he was just 2 years old, and the family was quite poor. So he was sent to the Greycoat School, which is right near Westminster Abbey in London. There's a plaque here today that notes his attendance at the school, and he's worked later on in Canada. He learned algebra and trigonometry and navigation, and that was intended to prepare young people for the Royal Navy. But when his education ended in 1784, the Navy didn't need any recruits, so he was sent as an apprentice to the Hudson's Bay Company in Churchill on Hudson Bay in Canada. And that would be the last he would see of England. He started as a clerk for several years and was soon sent out on missions to areas that are now in Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Alberta. In 1788, out in Saskatchewan, he fell down a bank and severely broke his leg. He had a very slow recovery, and so pretty soon he was moved east to Cumberland House, where there was better care for his broken leg. It's in what's now eastern Saskatchewan. And there David met Philip Turner, who was Hudson Bay Company's first surveyor. And from then on, his career began to change forever. Turner took a liking to Thompson, recognized his good math skills, so he began training him in practical surveying. Thompson was now pretty well hooked, and he developed a very passionate interest in surveying and mapping. He later said of the accident that it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. So let's divert just briefly here to talk about Philip Turner. He was a pretty remarkable man in his own right. He spent 12 years with the Hudson Bay Company, traveled more than 15,000 miles in the Canadian interior. This was mostly just to the west of Hudson Bay and then south towards Lake Superior. His last work was mapping Lake Athabasca, which is in the far north of what's now the province of Alberta. He produced 10 major maps of all this work. His last, which was prepared in 1794, measured 6.5 feet high, 8.5 feet wide, and it's currently in the archives of Manitoba, and it's considered one of Canada's very great cartographic treasures. Turner felt that the Hudson Bay Company wasn't giving him the support he needed. He went back to England in 1792, and he never returned to Canada. But before he left, he had urged the Hudson Bay Company to name David Thompson as their chief surveyor. Turner left behind a Cree wife and their children. These country marriages, as they were known, were common and usually temporary alliances. European traders often left their native wives and their mixed blood children behind to reunite with the tribes. So back in London, Turner married an English woman, completed the maps that he'd started, taught navigation for a while, died very poor in 1800. So now back to David. Turner wanted to take Thompson to Lake Athabasca, but David hadn't recovered well enough to make the trip. So he was restricted to just practicing the observations that Turner had taught him to do, and he became pretty good at it. But while he was practicing solar observations, he became blind in his right eye. And so this is how one of history's greatest surveyors started his career, with a very severe visual impairment. Before Turner completed the Athabasca surveys, Thompson had recovered enough to do some survey work locally. He made good use of his training. He completed some surveys in Saskatchewan, Alberta, Churchill River area. Here's a network of these surveys here in the Saskatchewan area, down towards Lake Winnipeg, up here to Hudson Bay, and up here is Lake Athabasca, the far upper left-hand corner. In 1794, he did succeed Turner as the chief surveyor for the Hudson Bay Company. The surveying techniques were fairly standard for the time. He would make repeated astronomical observations at trading posts, major geographical features, and then he averaged these to get greater accuracy of each point. He would have observed Jupiter's moons to determine Greenwich time and the sun's peak altitude to determine local time. He would have used pocket watches to keep time between these readings, and from these he could calculate longitude and also latitude from the observation of the sun. Here's a sketch by artist C.W. Jeffries. Shows him using a artificial horizon of Mercury. The mercury would have been stored in this flask, which is just here to the below Thompson's right foot. Jeffrey shows Thompson using his right eye, his blind right eye, which, but we can forgive him for that inaccuracy. It's, I think, a realistic portrait of how Thompson may have appeared in the field. Thompson would fill in the detail between these fixed points by compass, estimated distance traverses, either by canoe or on horseback or on foot. In 1797, the Hudson Bay Company halted their westward expansion, and they discouraged David from doing any more survey work. Thompson was disappointed, of course, so he quit the Hudson Bay Company, went to work for their rival, the Northwest Company of Montreal. This is a coat of arms you see here at the right. So another famous figure now comes into David's life, and that's Alexander Mackenzie. Mackenzie was a founder and a senior partner of the Northwest Company. He's very commercial minded. He wanted to expand operations out to the west with connections to Chinese markets via the Pacific Ocean. And this suited Thompson just fine. So we'll come back to Mackenzie here just a little bit later. Thompson had a very busy first year with the Northwest Company. He mapped the most of the Assiniboine River Basin area, which is in here just south of Lake Winnipeg, down to what's now the U.S.-Canadian border. He then explored and surveyed down to the Mandan Indian villages on the Missouri River in what's now North Dakota, where Lewis and Clark would pass by a few years later. He then circumnavigated, well, next he went into central Minnesota, and he found the source of the Mississippi River just about in here. And then he circumnavigated Lake Superior just in here. And around at this point, this is Grand Portage, which was the headquarters for the Northwest Company. Mackenzie wasn't one to pass out compliments very loosely, and he remarked that Thompson had done more in 10 months than what he expected could be done in 2 years. So Thompson started out with a very favorable impression by Northwest Company leaders. Now, in 1799, another big event occurred in David's life. He married Charlotte Small. She was the daughter of Patrick Small, who was a Scottish trader with the Northwest Company, and a Cree Indian mother. This was not the ordinary country marriage. It lasted for 57 years, And together they had 13 children. Charlotte and the children often traveled with David. This is a statue of them both, which is at Invermere, BC. It's done by Alberta sculptor Rich Ronish. Charlotte was very helpful to David. She helped him establish good relationships with the various tribes. And that helped him to learn the culture and local geography. She was named as a Canadian National Historic Person in 2008. I think very much deserved. Let's go back to Alexander Mackenzie again here, just briefly, to set the stage for this Columbia Brigade work. Mackenzie was a pretty hard driving Scot, very brave. As I said before, he was bent on finding a way to a Pacific port so he could further or shorten the trade route to China. The Rocky Mountains were a major barrier, of course, to this plan. So he had to find a suitable pass over the Rockies and then a navigable river to get to the Pacific. And Mackenzie was among the first to try. And in doing so, he made two rather famous trips in search of the Pacific. His first one was in 1789, and he traveled the full length of the Mackenzie River, which is named after him, of course. Starts here at Great Slave Lake, which is just about in here in Canada, and about same latitude of Anchorage in Alaska, which will be just over here. His purpose was to learn if the Mackenzie River flowed to the Pacific, hopefully to what was then known as Cook's River, which is now Cook Inlet at Anchorage. Cook got it wrong. He thought it was a river, but it turned out later that by Captain George Vancouver discovered it was only an inlet. At any rate, Mackenzie learned it didn't feed into this inlet, and instead it went to the Arctic Ocean, clear up and off the top of the map here. So this was not the route he was looking for. So on his second trip, which he started in 1793, he began here, again, Great Slave Lake, worked his way up to the summit of the Rocky Mountains over a rather short portage to us Americans. He went partway down what's now the Fraser River, down to about here. He wrongly assumed that this was the Columbia River that he was actually trying to find, but travel down the Fraser at this point became extremely difficult. As we know today, it's a very, very steep and rocky canyon, almost impossible to travel by canoe. Mackenzie was in a hurry to beat the winter, and so he made a shortcut over the coastal range just about here, which took him over to an Indian village, which is still there today, named Bella Coola on the Pacific shore, just about in here. So in making this trip across the Coast Range and arriving at Bella Coola, he became the first European to cross North America by land. It wasn't Lewis and Clark, as many are apt to believe, Mackenzie had beaten them by a full 13 years. So back to Thompson now in 1807. Let me move these over just a bit here. I need to, okay. Thompson was now at the upper reaches of the Saskatchewan River in what's now Alberta at this point on the map here, marked A. This time, he knew of Mackenzie's work over here, and that the Columbia River probably flowed somewhere along this route and down to this point here. Point B is where Lewis and Clark had found the Columbia at the confluence with the Snake River. So Thompson's goal was pretty clear. It was to get from point A to point B. But for him, everything in between these 2 points was a blank slate. He had no notion of what was out there. Now, the topography west of the Rocky Mountains in this area is some of the most rugged and broken of the world. And its river patterns are extremely complex. So here's the reality of what he was up against. This entire area, which he knew a little about, a very, very complex river pattern. Many of the rivers abruptly reverse course because of the effects of the mountain ranges. It took David Thompson 4 years to unravel this geographic puzzle. We have to keep in mind that he also had to attend the routine fur trading business and other tasks in between these exploring trips. And then he had to make an annual trip back to headquarters on Lake Superior. So his exploring time was somewhat limited. His work took him down 6 tributaries of the Columbia River. They're shown in pink here. The Canoe River here, Blaeberry River here, the Kootenai River, the Pend Oreille River, the Spokane River, and the Colville River. We don't have enough time to describe each one of these explorations in detail, fascinating as they are. So here's a quick summary of what happened. He began at the headwaters of the Saskatchewan River, actually just over here, east of Howes Pass. He found his way to Howes Pass and down the west side of the Rocky Mountains. He went down the Blaeberry River, which is this one just here. And at this point, he found a very large river running northward. Now, it was running the opposite direction from where he wanted to go. So he assumed quite reasonably that it was part of a more northern system. But it was actually the Columbia, which he was looking for. But just like Clark and Cook and Mackenzie, Thompson was not immune to making wrong assumptions either. So he traveled south up to the source lake of the Columbia, which is just at this point here near what is now Invermere, BC. And here he built Kootenai House, which is a trading post, and then a local native guide showed him across some flats here to what is known as the Kootenai River. Again, it was flowing south, the direction that Thompson needed to go. So he followed it down this way into northwestern Montana, into the tip of the Idaho Panhandle, and then crossed back over to the border into what's now Alberta to Kootenai Lake, which lies just in here. But he learned that this outfall from the Kootenai Lake is extremely rough, impassable by canoe. And so he gave up further exploration down the Kootenai. And he was very close to the Columbia, and he didn't really know it. So anyway, he had to return back to headquarters on Lake Superior. Came back the next season, crossed Howes Pass again, went up to Kootenai House, down the Kootenai River to a point near what's now Booner's Ferry in northern Idaho, just right here. Here he learned of a well-traveled native trail overland from the Pend Oreille River to sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here, from the Kootenai River to the Pend Oreille River. That will be just here. Just a moment here. He came down the Kootenai. He went overland, as I said, to what's near Sand Point just now, just here. He then explored down the Pend Oreille River, but at this point here, which is Medellin Falls, he was blocked again by the falls and by very rough country, and so again, he was very close to his Columbia River without knowing it, and so, but by now the season was over, and he had to return again back to Lake Superior headquarters, and so next season came back again, up the Columbia, down the Kootenai to about Bonners Ferry. Across to what's now Sandpoint, Idaho. And then he went overland from Sandpoint to a point what is near now Spokane, Washington. His men had established a trading post there called Spokane House. And I think it's believed to be the first European settlement in the eastern part of Washington state. So he explored down Spokane, but it was too rough. On the next trip, he again made the same trip down the Kootenai, across to the Pend Oreille, overland to Spokane. Then he learned of a river to the northwest of Spokane called the Colville. And sorry, hang on. Let's back up here. On his return trip, he came back to Howes Pass. He found his way blocked by the Kootenai tribes. They had incorrectly assumed that he was giving arms to their pagan enemies who lived to the east of the Rocky Mountains. So he was forced to retreat from crossing Howell's Pass. He had to retreat to the north and try to find another passage over the Rocky Mountains. And he found this at Athabasca Pass, which is just here. So here's another drawing by C.W. Jeffries. It shows him crossing Athabasca Pass in the middle of winter. So just try to feel the sting of the wind-driven snow and minus 20 degrees. It was a miserable trip and a very harsh time of the year. So he crossed the pass, went down the Canoe River, and at its mouth, he found another very big river. So this is the point right here at the mouth of the Canoe River, where the Columbia makes a nearly 180-degree bend from flowing north to almost directly south. At this time, the river's frozen, and Thompson and his crew were forced to camp out here at the mouth of the Columbia River. So he now knows that in recent years, Simon Fraser has explored down the Fraser River over here and learned that it entered the ocean here quite near what's now Vancouver, British Columbia. So he knows that the Fraser that Mackenzie had assumed is not the Columbia at all, and so that it must lie somewhere in this region. So he now suspects that he is on the Columbia, and the question is, does it flow south from this point on the Canoe River to where Lewis and Clark discovered the river on their transcontinental trip? So in the spring thaw of 1811, Thompson knew his provisions were very low. His men's morale was not much better. So he decided it was best to travel up the Kootenai River to Kootenai House to get fresh provisions, give his men a break. Probably kind of a tough choice because he'd risk running afoul of the angry Kootenai people again up here. But it turned out to be the right decision. So now, again, he goes down the Kootenai to Pend Oreille, over the trail to Sandpoint. Now this time, sorry I get this mixed up before, but then he finds his way overland to Spokane House. And this is where his men had set up a new post. Spokane House, which is just below what's now Spokane, Washington. And as I said before, this is probably one of the first European settlements in eastern Washington state. He then tried to travel down the Spokane River, but it was too rough for canoe travel. He then learned of a river to the northwest called the Colville, just here. So he explored down this. It's a wide, flat valley, very easy going. And he found that it discharged there into a very large river at a point at what is now Kettle Falls in Washington. Falls are now submerged by the pool behind Grand Coulee Dam. And finally, Thompson thinks he's got this puzzle unraveled. So this is what he now knows. He believes he's found the Upper Columbia here. He knows the Columbia flows from point B, where Lewis and Clark were, to the sea, and now he thinks he's very likely found it here at Kettle Falls. So what he has to do now is connect the dots. Canoe River, Kettle Falls, the Snake River mouth. So at Kettle Falls here, at Kettle Falls, just here, he builds a fleet of canoes, starts down the Columbia, goes through this wide sweep through central Washington, down to the Snake River confluence. And here he erects a post and a sign that claims all this area for Great Britain. He then continued on down the Columbia River to what is now Astoria. This is where John Jacob Astor had built a trading post, and it was also considering partnering with the Northwest Company. So Thompson spent just a few days here, and he quickly returned upriver to the Snake River confluence here, again at point B. Found some horses, took a shortcut overland back here to Spokane House. And very shortly after, then proceeded back here to Kettle Falls. He built canoes again. They're getting pretty good at this by now. And then he traveled upstream from here to the Canoe River. So, in doing so, taking this final, traveling over this final leg, he became the first European to travel the entire length of the Columbia River, almost 80% of it, which is all of this, for the very first time by a European. In doing so, he'd opened up a huge new territory for the Northwest Company, and he discovered quite a practical route from the Canadian interior to the Columbia and down to the Pacific Ocean. And this route was used for many years by the fur trade. So as soon as Thompson got back to the Canoe River, he very soon crossed back over Athabasca Pass, and he left the Columbia River for the last time. So back at Grand Portage, Thompson decided it was time that he retire from the field. Now, unlike with many of the other country marriages we talked about before, Charlotte and their children went with Thompson to Montreal and set up home. Soon after, they moved to Williamstown, Ontario, where the family lived for another 20 years. A plaque marks his house, which was built in 1804 and still exists there today. He was now pretty well off, and he'd become a partner and held shares in the Northwest Company. Spent the first 2 years after field retirement compiling his great map. The great map showed a tremendous amount of territory, clear from Hudson's Bay out here to the Pacific Ocean, and from latitude about 45 north down here to latitude 60 north, which would be just about up here. And parts of and the circumnavigation of Lake Superior as well in that. Here is the Great Map original, which is hanging in the archives of Ontario at Toronto. It measures 6.5 feet high. It's 10 feet wide, a little bit larger than Turner's map, made up of 25 individual sheets. Thompson glued them together with mucilage. So William McGilvery, who was then the chief of the Northwest Company, was probably quite amazed at seeing a whole chunk of the continent on the table in front of him. It's a very valuable asset for the Northwest Company. Here's a copy of the map which hangs in the reading room of the archives at in Ontario. Ontario in Toronto. The Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company merged in 1821. The Hudson Bay Company allowed the map to be published by Arrowsmith, who was a London cartographer, and no credit was given to Thompson. Another copy of Thompson's map exists at a replica of Fort William on the this is hard to pronounce, Kaministiquia River, which is at Thunder Bay, Ontario. That was the new headquarters for the Northwest Company. It had to be moved there from Grand Portage, Minnesota, when the US-Canadian border was surveyed, and the original headquarters at Grand Portage was found to be on the US side. Very sadly, Thompson lost most of his fortune through some very bad business investments. He was forced to support his family with local surveying jobs, and he worked later on the US and Canadian boundary surveys. He was quite disappointed with the Oregon boundary dispute resolution 18, which was in 1846, and it agreed the border is the 49th parallel. Thompson felt strongly that it should have been the Columbia River, where he had spent so much time exploring its course and claiming the territory for Great Britain. In 1845, he began writing his memoirs, a pretty monumental work of 702 handwritten pages. He described the geology and the botany, zoology, anthropology, meteorology of all the places he visited. It was found more than a century later by J.B. Tyrrell, as we mentioned before. He transcribed it and edited the work and published it as David Thompson's narrative of his travels in Western America, 1784 to 1812. Here's a page, title page of the Ontario Archives copy that we see just here on the right. The book became a very valuable source for researchers of early Canada. So David Thompson died penniless in Montreal, February 10th, 1857. Charlotte died 3 months later. They're buried next to each other here at Mount Royal Cemetery in Montreal. This column with a big sextant on the top marks their graves. It's unfortunately, it's now been removed because of the security concerns. But sadly, Thompson never received any recognition for this vast amount of work that he had done throughout the interior and western parts of Canada and the US. The American Society of Civil Engineers and Canadian Society for Civil Engineers plaque, which recognizes Thompson's survey work, will be displayed at the reconstruction of Fort William near Thunder Bay, Ontario, that we mentioned before. The ASCE Minnesota and Montana sections participated in this nomination. They plan to display identical plaques at places which they've yet undecided. The Inland Empire section over here in Eastern Washington declined to participate, but I hope in the future we can convince them to do so. His Columbia Basin work in Eastern Washington certainly very noticeable. So in closing, that's the very brief story of the greatest land geographer to have lived. He and his contemporaries, Sir Alexander Mackenzie and his mentor, Philip Turner, still relatively unknown today. They're too often overshadowed by the popular account of Lewis and Clark, who really achieved much less than any of the three of them. His lifelong marriage to Charlotte Small gave him a great insight to the native cultures of early Canada, allowed him to work so well with them. She's truly a Canadian national historic person. His surveying and mapping accomplishments were certainly unprecedented in magnitude. And his memoirs are, as I said before, a real treasure trove for researchers of early Canada. I'd like to make a few acknowledgements here. Michael Bartlett, who's chair of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering History and Heritage Committee, did all the work on these slides and the various maps. And he also took on the very hard task of coordinating the final draft of the landmark nomination. Cole Bedford on our ASCE History and Heritage Committee contributed a great deal to the drafting of the nomination as well, and seeing it through the approval process. Mike's History and Heritage team also contributed quite a bit to the input to for the nomination package. And my special thanks goes to Alexander Mackenzie, a good friend and a former CSCE president. 12 years ago, he inspired me to learn more about David Thompson, and that's what led to this work being nominated as an IHCL, International Historic Civil Engineering Landmark. There were two very helpful ladies living in Sandpoint, Idaho, Clara Christie, Holly Ellis, gave us these very nice photographs of David's statue in Sandpoint, one of which we see here. It so nicely portrays Thompson as a surveyor that we decided we would show it twice. There's some very well researched and entertaining books for learning more about Thompson and his contemporaries. For Thompson, Sources of the River by Jack Nisbet, who's a Washington State historian, is an excellent read. Canadian historian Barry Goff's First Across the Continent is a good account of Mackenzie's life. And First Crossing by Derek Hayes, another Canadian map historian, is an excellent account of Mackenzie's trip to the Pacific. The last good resource is Mapmaker, which was written by Barbara Mitchell, very well researched, and it's a well-written biography of Turner. She is a descendant of his Metis family, and she also taught at Trent University in Ontario. And then a final thanks to Seattle section leaders who invited me to make this presentation: Cindy Hirsch, Omera Flores, Ross Brazil, Don Nguyen, and finally, thanks Ashraf for holding my hand and getting used to hooking up this Zoom connection. So I'll take any questions any of you may have, and thank you again very much. Back to you, Don.
Dave, that was very interesting history. I see that we have a couple comments. First, there's a reason that the 49th parallel, not Columbia River, was agreed as the border. It has to do with a skirmish between British and Americans near the end of the War of 1812. And then to follow up, can you please pronounce Sequim, the city you're
Swim.
in? Swim?
Swim. Rhymes with swim.
Oh. Yeah, there's a lot of Native American towns in Washington that sometimes it's hard to know how they all pronounced.
Can you repeat that, please, Don?
Well, I was saying there's a lot of Native American towns in Washington, so it's hard to know how they are all pronounced, I think. Barbara then defends
it. Some are difficult to pronounce, particularly for those who don't live here. Puyallup is a tough one. Squim's another, but you just learned how it's pronounced.
Let me stop